All right, now you may start.
All right, I'm David Millstone. I live in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and I'm delighted to have these people here to be talking about this.
I'm Tony Parks. I'm originally from New York City, now from the Boston area, and my specialty is New England squares.
I'm Phil Jameson. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and my area that I love are the traditional Southern Appalachian squares.
I'm Bob Delsimer. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. I've been here in North Carolina for 20 years now, and I'm coordinator of music and dance programs at John C. Campbell Folk School.
I'm Jim Mayo. I've lived most of my life in New Hampshire, still do, and I am the token modern square dancer in the crowd.
My name is Larry Edelman, and originally I'm from Pennsylvania. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I like to play and call traditional square dance.
My name is Bill Lichman. I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and my favorite is traditional Western square.
So we've heard a bunch of different styles mentioned: New England, Southern Appalachian, traditional Western, and modern Western. Is that it? Is that the universe? Does that define what squares are? If we try to come up with a categorizing them, you know?
I think there are other regions that might be considered. For instance, the Maritime Canadian.
Or Northern Midwest, or Northwest America.
Northwest.
I know nothing about Northwest America.
And then there are Irish set dances. That's a whole, I mean, we're talking squares, but we're talking about North American
Done in
squares.
squares and done by people in this country, either because they were Irish and wanted to do the dances they done in the old country, or these days revival groups doing them. So yes, where do we draw the line?
Are they relevant? Are they related to the other kinds of squares that we do?
Certainly they are. You can't leave out Southwestern Spanish either, for quadrilles particularly. So, and yes, they are all related to one another.
And a couple different varieties of Southwestern dance, both Southwest as in New Mexico side of Southwest, but also California, which had totally different choreography, but the early dances of California had lots of quadrille figures.
They did.
It would be lovely if we could find people to be involved in this project who did represent the areas that are widely unrepresented here, for instance, the Northwest and the Maritimes. I'm thinking of this as North American square dance, not just U.S.
Right.
Well, and then the conversation we had a little while ago, by square dance, are we talking about a formation of a set, or are we talking about a description of a social event at which there may be a couple different formations that exist at that dance?
Or couple dances.
Yeah, and so when we talk about square dance, what are we talking about? An evening social event, or are we talking about a formation done for one particular piece of choreography?
We're going to end up with a bunch of video clips, and we're going to want to be able to categorize these clips to say this is an example of a certain group of dances. I mean, we're not going to say this is a dance from Glenville, and this is the only place, it's a unique to itself. It's clearly related to something else, or Independence, or traditional New England. So what are the categories that make sense when we have a controlled vocabulary to list for the dances? What do we?
I still think of Contra as part of square dance, because when I went to my first square dance with Ralph Page, he alternated squares and contras. Right. And we also did folk dances, the Road to the Isles and Schottish.
But the evening was called a square dance.
I went to a square dance with Ralph Page.
Exactly.
And it included all of that.
Unlike today's contra dancers who think that maybe square dance is a part of contra dance.
There's some square dance evenings that don't have any square figures in them. So, examples in Alaska, the Athabascan dances are done in big circles. But they call it a square dance.
Don't some of the Appalachian?
Right. Well, we call our big circle dances square dances.
Right.
As a generic term.
Right.
I think at some point the term square dance kind of replaced the term country dance, which in English at least for many hundreds of years meant, I think, a group of couples
Mhm.
dancing together in some kind of set.
Yeah.
And at some point, I think square dance kind of replaced that in America, at least, as the
That's
term
kind of how I think of it.
would define a group of couples dancing together, which could include both squares and contras and big circle.
Yeah, and at a lot of square dance events, there are also couple dances where the couples don't depend on each other, but the defining feature, I think, is that a good portion of the dances in an evening like that are group dances, dances for more than one couple working together.
So I'm still waiting for my list of categories, my controlled vocabulary.
I resist it a little bit because I'd hate for us to get too categorical about these categories. An example would be, one of the things that I think Bob helped alert us to back in the late 70s or mid 70s was, the fact that there could be two towns in West Virginia, 20 miles apart, who dances were totally different from one another. They might share a couple figures, but the difference between Buchanan and Helvetia, Bob, and so I'm thinking that I think we have to be careful about having a category and thinking that what was in that category is homogenous at all, because
Right.
there was such tremendous variation within any of these categories that it almost loses the meaning to say this is this, because within that there was tremendous variation.
Well, go ahead, Bob.
I was just gonna say, we did go through this process of defining some categories for nils, and I have to say, I don't remember what the categories were that we came up with for his website.
Well, he ended up with 6, I think. He had New England quadrilles, help me
I
here.
meant to look this up
Right,
before I came.
Southern Appalachian, traditional Western, modern Western, singing squares, and what he called contemporary traditional, sort of people who are writing dances, Gene Hubert or someone like that, writing dances for today's mostly contra dancers in one or another, borrowing figures from everything. So taking figures from a traditional Western dance or something else, and so those were the 6 I think that he ended up with.
But those sound good, and as Larry says, within, say, the Southern Appalachian tradition, there's a lot of variation, but they're definitely different from the other genres.
I mean, when you were pointing to Bob, I mean, is there enough in common between the West Virginia dances that's a distinct category from Kentucky set running, or from Southern Appalachian, or from New England style? I mean, how fine do we have to get to make it useful for someone who wants to, we'll end up with, say, 200 video clips, and someone wants to call up all the clips that show a certain style that are somehow connected. How, as opposed to this clip is different from this clip. I mean, each of those 200 clips will be different, but some of them will have more in common.
That goes to what you're calling for on this sheet of how do we identify so that you can search for.
Yeah.
And what labels do we put on each of the things that we collect?
I think of 2 broad categories. Where's my asbestos suit? I see most of the squares that I've encountered, I could put into 2 broad categories. One being the across the set figures that may have been influenced by the quadrille tradition, and the visiting couple,
Yes.
more circular motion figures that come from who knows where, and I know Phil is working on studying the origins of that. I haven't really found anything that I could say is outside of those 2 traditions. I think there are some figures that we all know, like Divide the Ring or Forward 6, where it's hard to say. They may be a blend of both.
Texas Star.
But
Where's that fall?
Yes, the whole square of figures like that. But I do agree with you, Tony, because of the 2 streams of the way I think about square dancing. From England, the quadrille style, and from Ireland, the visiting couple style of dancing. And that's a major division between amongst square dances that would be easy and simple to do. they're also identifiable by some other figure usage that New England squares do this, and southern squares and western squares do that, and they are dividable that way. So that's a useful major subdivision of square dancing.
Yeah, I do find that each region has its distinct personality. The swings tend to be longer in the northeast and perhaps shorter in the southwest.
And the later you get in time, the more mixed they become.
But I think that every regional square tradition that I've encountered seems to have elements of one or both of those broad general categories of the across the set or the circular swoopy visiting style.
Sure.
When you said from England, you mean coming from France, from the
From
quadrilles?
Europe,
Right,
basically.
okay, right.
The quadrille style.
As opposed to Irish.
As opposed to Irish, which seem to be quite different.
So where do we find, I mean, New England clearly draws from that English-French quadrille influence. Where's the Irish? Is that what's affecting, is that?
I wouldn't say Irish,
All right.
but there's a lot of things that go into the southern dances, and I've spent a lot of time trying to just, for my little realm of the dance world, define what I think of as a Southern Appalachian square, and how is it different than a Western or a modern Western or a New England. And I have some clear definitions, and it might be useful for each of these, if there's 6 genres, to define each of them very clearly, and that way you can see the differences. So I mean, I've thought a lot about the southern squares, so I could easily share that with you, but maybe that's for the other interview. Or
Well, we'll do some of that there. You want to do a quick go around and see what reactions you
Yeah.
get? And you
I could say three
Sure.
boil it down to 3 things. The first is basically the structure of the southern squares. It's a closed set. Your partner's beside you as opposed to across like in a contra dance. Verse chorus structure, which comes from the cotillions, the French cotillions, and visiting couple figures, which come, where the visiting couple figures comes from is kind of fuzzy, but basically there's some from the Scots-Irish, some of the figures are from Scots-Irish, others are from English country dances, others are from other places, quadrilles even. So the structure is one of the main things. The second thing I think about with southern squares is that now the camera's on, I'm blanking out. So the structure, I feel like Rick Perry.
I was just saying. There's 3 departments I want to get rid of.
And the third
Okay.
thing.
No, I know the third one. Okay. Number two. It's not the Department of whatever, but it's the distinctive southern figures, such as bird in a cage, things that you would not find in a New England
Or do-si-do.
square, and the southern do-si-do. There's certain distinctive figures that are really from that tradition. You don't find ladies' chains, for example. And the third thing is just the what Sharp called propulsive nature of the dances. They're kind of fast, and the calling is improvisational and not phrased to the music. So it's not like a contra dance, or when I think of New England squares, I think of 2 A's, 2 B's, and the tunes can be crooked tunes, have short parts, and the calling can be totally improvisational. And obviously these 3 characteristics share things with the other styles, but I see those as the 3 things that really define the Southern tradition.
You bet. And that's true also in the Western, which comes from the Southern.
Right.
Because
But
of migration.
In the Western, I think of a lot of figures that involve like all 4 ladies chain. Those, am I right that those are
modern.
Those are more modern
More
than
modern
Western?
than the kinds of things you're thinking of
Right.
here.
Would that be the quadrille influence?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
it would be.
That's right.
So, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. In addition to us talking about, the formations and more kind of clinical descriptions of choreography, the 2 other things that I think we need, 3 other things. One that Phil alluded to that I think we need to throw into the mix. One is the issue of the music. is the music between the styles. To me, is like, we really have to spend a lot of time focusing on that. The second is calling style. That hasn't come up yet. Calling style is hugely important because there's such differences among the differences. And then, so one is calling style, one is the, what's the first one I said? Music. The third is, what Phil alluded to, is the concepts of phrasing and timing among and between the styles is another thing that really, is just a variable to talk about with all that. The other thing that Phil mentioned that I think, Phil, is really important about those distinctive Southern figures that you mentioned, they're described colorfully rather than literally. In other words, in some traditions you describe circle left, lady's chain right and left. The words describe figures, where in the Southern tradition it's either about generally animals or animal husbandry. Well, it's much more flirtatious in terms of chase that rabbit, chase that squirrel, chase that pretty guy around the world, rather than a quadrille might say, with the lady in the lead, go around the lady. And Ted Sinnell and I used to have these conversations that it's much more
lady around the lady, gent around the gent.
It's much more abstract and much more metaphorical about, when you look at the Southern figures, they very often are labeled by metaphor and rather than by rote description.
And you would have to know what they mean in order to dance.
You would.
Mow the wheat and mow the clover doesn't tell you anything about the movements.
And there's a huge variety of figures in the Southern tradition that may only appear in that one dance.
Yeah.
Whereas a lady's chain, once you know it, you can, it shows up in
what
lots.
Ricky Holden called dominant figure dances as opposed to glossary dances.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But also the Southern dances are very much, I see them in the folk tradition where every caller might know Chase the Rabbit, but there's different variants of it. There's not just one figure called Chase the Rabbit, but there's a lot of different versions, and even with that, every caller has their own way of doing it, which is more from the oral tradition rather than the written tradition. These dances are not written down, and that's part of why they're so hard to trace.
And the dance itself is not permanent. It's the figure that's permanent, not the dance.
Right, and I might call it two different ways, 2 different nights.
Yeah.
Or in the same dance, 2 different ways.
Right.
And there are not only multiple figures for the same name, there are multiple names for the same figure, right?
Right.
The same thing could turn up under 2 different names in 2 different communities.
That's Phil. What you just said really resonates with me about it being an oral tradition as song, not as a written tradition. The example I'll give is in the 80s, I was collecting square dances in Western Pennsylvania and video recording them, and I was spending time with one particular caller, and I just connected with his fiddler at the time. So at the time, his fiddler would have been in his 20s. Now his fiddler's in his mid-50s and spends more time calling than playing. And he was a great square dance fiddler. And I said, well, tell me about that. How'd that happen? He just told me how it metamorphosized. I said, so how many dances do you know? He said, I could probably call 4 4-hour square dances without repeating a dance. And I said, do you ever write them down? He said, not a one of them. He said, not one of them is written down.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, they're not composed, and they're not composed dances, and you don't have to write them down. I mean, the only reason I write my dances down is so I remember what I know. It's like my set list, my tune list, but you don't have to do that. The other thing you mentioned about the calling is that I see Southern dances, the calling is calling, and I think of in New England, or say with contra dances, it's prompting. And there's a big difference between prompting and calling.
Definitely.
And
that's a good division between the kinds of dances that we're talking about too. So all of these things that you've mentioned, music, the figure, the style of dance, the calling, all of those things are bases for dividing up the world of square dancing in America into those 2 piles.
But if you think all New England calling is prompting,
right? No, I know
it's not now. But has that always been true?
Well, I'm talking about mainly when squares were fashionable in New England from the early 20th century up until the Contra revival kind of crowded squares out.
Yeah.
As I understand it, and this was pretty much before my time, but as I understand it, the singing call reigned supreme, and
Yes.
the calling was not prompted, it was cadence calling. The dancers and the caller were doing the same thing at the same time, so the dancers had to know the dance because they didn't get cued
Yeah,
ahead.
but I think the difference that Phil, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth or ideas in your head. The difference between the prompting and the calling was not necessarily where the call was placed against the beat or the phrase of the music, but the fact that the choreography was defined versus the choreography not being defined.
Right, and with the singing call, it's defined. You're
It
locked
is.
into
Okay,
this.
yeah,
this-
I would,
this-
I would submit that if it's not
this-
cued ahead, it's not really prompting.
So,
But I would say that the two, to me, the two most important characteristics of a New England square are the fact that it is phrased to the music, whether or not the calling is,
Right.
whether the calling is ahead of the phrase or on the phrase, the dancers are dancing
Right.
with the phrase. The other is the long swings. I think
Yes.
those two things more than anything make a square a New England square or a
That's
northeastern
that's
square.
a good set of characteristics.
One thing I thought you were going to go with this, Tony, and Jim, you have to. I recall hearing recordings of Ralph Page calling square dances that were not phrased.
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely.
Tell us about that.
The recordings that I have heard of Ralph Page, they're not prompted. He tended to call with the phrase rather than ahead of the phrase,
Yeah.
but for the most part, I think they are phrased.
No, I agree for the most part, but I've
Yeah.
heard some examples that seem.
Okay, I can't remember any
Does it-
offhand.
does that
I'm not,
resonate with you, Jim?
I'm not saying there weren't any, I just
Yeah.
can't
He
remember
didn't
any.
always call strictly phrased actions.
Yeah.
I was telling David on the way down here, I remember, I believe he went to Shaw's in '49, and that he came back from that and tried an Alamandar.
Mhm.
Which blew, I was ready to
Was
jump
not
out
gonna
the
be phrased.
airplane.
That's hard.
Thought-
I was on the
thought of
floor,
Ralph Page calling an Alabama
Yeah,
Dar,
but
just,
see, that's a.
but he called it
influence
through,
from
he
the
didn't teach it, he just called it to the floor, and they listened to him, which was sort of surprising for New England callers, and for New England dancers, but they did it. I went up afterwards and talked with him about it, he said, well, I guess I won't do that again. And I don't think he ever did, but, so, he wasn't glued to the phrase of the music.
Well, he was fond of calling hash using just the New England basics.
That's right.
He referred to it as calling a confusion square. And he would ad lib and see if the dancers could keep up with him. But that was a novelty. He would do it
Occasionally.
once in an evening or once every few evenings.
Yeah.
His norm was to call
Strictly
figures that
phrased.
could be danced on the phrase.
Yeah. Phil, you were nodding when you were talking, when Phil was describing his square,
Yes.
saying, that had the influence on the Western. I mean,
Definitely.
Can you sort of summarize key points of what makes it a traditional Western square in your mind?
Traditional Western square, I think, does not use, the older traditional Western squares do not use quadrille figures like ladies' chains and right and left through. They use arm turns, they'll use arches, they'll use circles or serpentines, lines like grapevine twist, that sort of a thing. They're commonly visiting couple, or they're set up like visiting couple. You think of even a modern dance like Northern Lights, if you're familiar with that. That must,
Hey.
yes, exactly. But that must be done as a visiting couple dance. It cannot be done with opposing couples. If you try to do it with opposing couples, it simply won't work at all. So it's a visiting couple dance, but it's a modern sort of Western dance. There's no ladies' chains in it. There's swings, but there's no ladies' chains. I don't think the Western swing was ever limited to just two hands, a two-hand turn. It was an arm-around swing. So those things are ordinary for a Western traditional square.
let me ask you about the back-to-back do-si-do.
Yeah,
Was that part of the tradition?
it was walk around your left-hand lady.
And it was, but not
And
called
it was- And it
do-si-do.
was not back-to-back.
So it was a face,
It was like
Like a
a
gypsy?
gypsy,
Yeah.
Like a sidestep.
and that
or
was,
a chassé, or a
Sachet
sachet.
around
That's
the corner.
what I think that is.
Yes, but the earlier one was the walk around
Yeah.
figure.
and a right, left through?
Wasn't
No,
none,
none, okay.
there weren't any.
And so tell me, I know it's hard, about what time period you're talking about.
Certainly before Lloyd Shaw.
Yeah, yeah,
Turn of the century.
yeah, up to about Lloyd Shaw, you're thinking
Yeah,
about,
maybe.
yeah, yeah.
That would have been late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're talking Texas, New Mexico, not so much Arizona, but some Arizona
Mhm.
later,
Mhm.
late thirties, like sort of. But certainly Texas. I mean, Jimmy Clausen started calling in the teens, 20s. That's the kind of thing he would be doing. And he called it chop suey when he made it up as he went along, which was essentially all that he did.
Is
And
Gregerson from that same time period?
Gregerson is later,
Later.
but he was from the same sort of area. Eventually he settled in
El
Ruidoso.
Paso. Oh,
And El Paso, yeah, that area.
Well, that whole Texas movement, I think, was so much more important than some of the other states.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it was West Texas where everything was happening,
Yeah.
it seemed.
But they were directly related to Appalachian dancing. because-
Sure.
They had come from there probably.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, look at the migration
sure,
patterns.
people moved west.
People, and they brought their dances with them. That's where you get the sources of dancing.
Mhm.
So, folk dancing, not society dancing.
Right.
That's different. And New England is complicated by society dancing and the influences of that. But the southern people, when they moved, they went to Alabama, Mississippi,
And the same
Arkansas.
music too.
Texas, and took their music
Same
with
music.
them.
Just
They
as
took
New
their
Englanders moved due west to Ohio, for
Right.
instance.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and to the northern states.
Probably onto
with
the
Michigan.
west, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when we get out to
Strong
western
New England
dance, I
South
mean,
tradition.
the Southwest, there's not that New England influence
No.
being felt because they didn't,
No,
those folks didn't go there.
no.
They went right to California.
They went over the top, because that was the direction. It was based on agriculture.
Sure.
The migratory patterns followed the weather patterns and the soil conditions, and people knew how to grow things here, so they knew how to grow them in the new place. And California dancing and the Spanish influence in Arizona and New Mexico didn't seem to mix well with the southern dance that came in, sort of usurping. I guess it was basically because the Spanish people and the Anglos didn't mix either.
That's right, and there's a very extraordinary, distinction between the dances of New Mexico and right across the border in Texas were very different the way they would have done.
Of course,
Because
Texas,
New Mexico had more of the Spanish influence?
absolutely.
Absolutely.
And Texas went right up to the Rio Grande River, all the way north and south. And New Mexico, or the settlements, the Spanish settlements, were pretty rare to the east of the Rio Grande, but were common along the Rio Grande and west.
Which is why when you look at Lloyd Shaw's collections, it's much closer, where he lived in Colorado Springs to New Mexico, but it was mostly Texas figures that he was collecting.
Yeah, I
Although
wish
he wouldn't say it, he wouldn't have said that.
I wish he had noted down where he got all of his figures.
Yeah.
Well,
But he didn't.
But let's talk about that for a second, because that's an interesting dynamic to all this conversation. Is, you gotta be a little bit egotistical to have the audacity to be a caller, okay? To want to be the one telling everyone what to do.
And enjoy it.
And I would have to say that this issue that we're talking about, that here's this collector of dances, figures, and teacher, and he had tentacles that he really influenced a lot of the country, Lloyd Shaw. He didn't reference the dances that he collected by individual or region very often. I saw the same thing, I don't know if you did, Bob, in Western Pennsylvania, where I would, be recording in 10 Grange halls and fire halls and would see similarities of figures, and I'd say, where'd you get that? And he'd say, oh, I don't remember, and I'd just be thinking to myself, he knows where he got that dance. But they weren't generous in terms all the time of acknowledging that, and so it's very interesting that there's a lot of lost information, is my point.
Yeah. You have to be real sneaky about how you get it back.
Yeah, there's a lot of competition
Yeah.
between callers
Yeah.
too,
Yeah.
and that
Complicates
tends to
things.
generate
Stealing
that.
I think you're right, and that's, when I said ego, I think that was another dynamic is you're right, the
Defense
competition.
mechanisms.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You had to go outside to write it down. You couldn't sit on the side of the hall
yeah,
and
and,
steal the material.
yeah, although I do remember calling dances where at the break went out on the floor and I came back and there's 10 people on stage looking through my notes. Right.
They say that in the old days, if caller A was calling the dance and he saw caller B come in at the door, he would change his program and not call some of his hottest material. There's something curious about New England dancing and dancing in Northeast in general, New York State in particular. Since at least the 1930s and probably earlier, there's been a strong visiting couple tradition, and I have no idea where it came from, whether it came up from the South or whether there's an Irish influence or anything, but there are places where visiting couple dances were the norm, and there would be some quadrille figures like right and left through a lady's chain, but very often it would be the equivalent of first couple out to the right, swing your opposite, swing your own, on to the next. And people,
Nellie Gray.
in fact, when I was first getting into square dancing in depth in the 1960s, it was pretty universal to refer to that as Eastern style as opposed to Western style, which usually meant modern with more freewheeling choreography.
And that Eastern-Western style terminology that you're commenting on here was in the 60s?
This was in the 60s in the Northeast.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, and people referred to the what they thought of as indigenous, and again, I wish I knew where it came from and when, but what was pretty much the norm before modern square dancing came in, of the visiting couple, long swings, circle the left, swing your opposite, swing your own, onto the next, done to many different tunes in an evening, usually singing calls. Floyd Woodhull in Elmira, New York, was probably the best known of that breed of caller. But that kind of dancing was and is common in New England. New England, it's not so common anymore because there aren't that many Eastern square dance events in New England, but the ones that do exist, that's the kind of material they're doing. Largely singing calls, largely visiting couple, not a lot of quadrille influence. So, New England and the Northeast are by no means a monolith in terms of choreography.
I think it was in the Tolman Page book that they would talk about a caller in the 1930s who was traveling across the country and doing some of these kind of visiting couple dances.
They did say that, was it Happy Hale who claims to be a well-known figure from Maine to California.
So that's the name I was thinking of. But I've been really curious about the visiting couple thing, so I want to know where it comes from. And there are, if you look at the Playford squares, there are visiting couples in there. If you look at some of the cotillions and quadrilles, occasionally you'll find a visiting couple. There was a prompter in Boston who put out a book in Boston, I can't remember his name, in the late 1800s, who has some visiting couples, but they're nothing like the bird in the cage or the duck for the oyster, those kind of things. And when I first started calling dances, I was living north of the Adirondacks in New York State. And I would go to local Grange halls and VFWs and such, and those are the kind of dances that people were doing. And I've always wondered, did those dances migrate northward, or were they always there?
Some of it was the beginning of mass communication. Tolman and Page say right in their book that the radio barn dance band with its rhyming caller has had an influence on New England square dancing.
Yeah,
and in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, so in my research, the reason I kind of cut it off by about the 1930s is by then the radio and the records and the traveling callers and all that is blurring.
You can't tell where anything really came from.
And Phil, that sounds very similar to some of the musical trends too. Like for instance, Ralph listening to the radio.
Sure.
And how that affected the music as well.
Oh yeah.
So, and a lot of people think that Southern fiddlers don't play jigs or never play jigs, but that's just not the case.
Yeah.
It's just Southern fiddlers today.
Right.
Well, no,
some.
Yeah, so
well, jigs, I think by the 20th century, jigs were pretty much gone from the repertoire. And if you look at the recordings that were made in the 20s, the only jigs you'll find are somebody playing Irish Washerwoman that was not one of the ones brought with the early settlers.
Or tunes called jigs that aren't jigs.
Well, jig didn't mean 6/8 time back then.
Yeah.
It just meant fast.
Yeah.
So out of all, we haven't heard from our modern person here, so how do these strands combine to bring us to modern square dancing?
I've just been sitting here listening to a lot of new information, and it's beginning to sound to me as though the point where modern began was Lloyd Shaw.
Yes, I tend to agree with that.
That he sort of took all of these pieces and blended them, and then brought people from all over the country to his institutes.
He not only brought them to Colorado Springs, but of course he took his dancers elsewhere. His
Yes,
first
he
big
took the
move
demo
was to
group
go to
around the
Washington,
country.
D.C.,
Yeah,
the National Folk Festival. I think is what it was.
1939.
yeah.
Yes, and then traveled to the West Coast as well. He just was sort of into everything.
And clearly influenced Osgood,
Lots
and,
of,
and Osgood's whole
yeah,
category of callers.
sure.
So that it appears that the place where these things began to blend and get distributed was there.
And he found the square dance for himself explosively at the Colorado Seed Show in fall of 1934.
Hmm.
That's when it started. And he was so entranced with that, he grabbed the caller, or the one he could get a hold of, and coerced him, who happened to be Colorado Springs caller, coerced him to come to the school and teach
Teach
his
them square.
kids how to dance, and teach his teachers how to call them, so that he could have a self-contained program. That's when it began.
Do we know the caller's name?
I could probably make a guess, but
I mean, did Shaw ever give him credit?
no.
He was already interested in folk dancing.
Oh,
His kids
definitely.
were already
Right.
doing
From
folk
19
dance
from
from
1920,
Elizabeth
that was
Birchenough.
Elizabeth Birchenough,
Right,
who visited Denver about that time.
right, and he heard
He
her
brought her
speak.
down and started to teach the folk dancing, but he felt the square dancing was much better because it was American.
Right.
And it was group. It wasn't individual performance, it was group. He canceled team sports from Cheyenne School because it was so much of an individual performance, and all the rest of the school was just standing around worshiping the players. So he wanted something that everybody could participate
And
in
dancing was
all the
it.
time, and the dancing was the big
Yeah.
thing.
Well, and people looked forward to being on the first team the way they used to in football.
Surely.
So, another thing I'd just like to throw into the mix then, you know, when we talked about, well, we're talking about formations and calling style and music, et cetera. The other thing is the social context of what role the dance played in people's lives as recreation,
As
as
a folk
sport, as folk, you know,
Yeah.
expression, whatever it is. And that really was different, both within and among these different styles we're talking about. Just
That's true.
what was the role?
Definitely.
What was the role in that
Wasn't that
community of the dance?
Because I've always assumed, I mean, Mary Dart in her dissertation talked about, it used to be community dances and now it's dance communities. In other words,
Yeah.
now people find each other and dance as a hobby. In the old days, the people who lived near each other would get together just to socialize, and dancing was part of that. And I had kind of assumed that it was more or less the same in all the regions. Are you saying that there are some definite differences that you can put your finger on?
Yes, you have to distinguish between dancing activities as a social activity in a larger community like New York City or some of the coastal cities even in the South versus dancing in a small town in Pennsylvania or New England.
Or it would be everybody who lived.
Yeah, it's
Well,
just the local.
Whereas in a city, it's true, it would be subgroups.
What made me think of that a little? I think there are similarities, but what made me think of that was when I first encountered communities where they kept the same partner and the same square all night,
Mhm.
and when I would interview them and talk to them about it, it was different in different places. But here's a couple of takes on it. One was, this dance happens once a month, and these are neighbors. We're either steel workers, or we're farmers, or we're mill workers, and we get together with our friends who live 30 miles away. You know, it was a county-based dance, you know, not a city-based. And they would call their friends and say, let's get a square together for the West Middleton dance. And they would do that. And everyone who came to the dance was welcome, but not in that square. The other thing I heard is in some communities based on religion and based on history, what someone said to me once was, you never dance with another man's wife, ever. And that's where fights happen at dances, is when, and so I guess what I'm saying is there are variations, and I was interviewing older dancers. 201, everyone met their husband or wife at a dance in their community in these very rural areas, because that's where it happened. That's where young kids came, and that's where teenagers, 80-year-olds told me stories about being a teenager and ducking a girl's father so that he could give her a more intimate swing on the dance floor. And so, you know, a lot of the social nature of, like you said, where that dance sat in how that community got together.
I think a big part of that, I mean, I've thought a lot about this dance community versus community dance too. And in the old days, the dance was a function of the community. They were intergenerational. The girl's father would be there too. There would be little kids, and there'd be people there. And I've seen this at dance when I go to regional dances that actually are community dances. There are people who come who are members of the community who don't even dance, but just come because it's where the community is. And at this gathering of the community, yes, there's some dancing, but you don't have to be a dancer to be part of it. Nowadays, and I think of the modern Western movement like that, the people who come are dancers. It's a community of dancers. And if you aren't, and with a contra dance nowadays, if you aren't a dancer, you're not part of it. People wouldn't go to a contra dance
To sit and watch.
to sit and watch.
Yeah.
You go there because you're part of the community of dancers, but also nowadays communities are bigger geographically. It's not just the little village of Brasstown or whatever.
Transportation is so good that you can choose your neighbor, your virtual neighbors.
Right.
You can seek out like-minded people
Okay, so
rather than hanging out with the people who live next door.
Right, so this weekend we have people coming from Seattle. This is our community,
Intentional community.
It's
Right.
also true that in modern square dancing, the popularity, the huge growth of it, occurred during a period when the women stayed home all day and really wanted to get out and do something, and they found this activity that their man was willing to go to at least once. And it was perfectly easy then to get them to stay. And again, I told David on the way down here, for 20 years, I could guarantee my clubs that if they brought somebody through the door, I would keep them for the whole lesson series. And it was easy to do because it was the one social thing that couples could do together. Otherwise, the men went off and did this, and the women did that. But the fact that this was an activity that they could share was a very powerful promotional tool for modern square dancing. And we made them part of a group. And that's the other thing that, unfortunately, I think modern square dancing failed to understand adequately. We could have capitalized on it a lot more, but the most powerful attraction of our activity was its social value. It made people part of a group, and you joined a club. You shared a costume. You had a regular
doing the work.
You had a regular opportunity to get together, and I marvel that the club executive committees that met once a month, 6 couples would get together and work for an hour to lay out the month's program. When I was running my own program, Joanne did that in a half an hour once a year. We knew what was going to happen every time, and so did they. But they got together because they liked each other, and it provided a kind of social interaction that wasn't available.
Yeah, and there's no better way to bond with people than working on something with them.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that was a much more powerful attraction than the dancing.
And I can't tell you how many couples I've met, who do modern dancing, who told me that I'm not sure we'd be married today if it wasn't for this activity that we did together.
Yep.
I also met some other couples who said, I met my second husband.
There's a lot of that.
Well, that happens in the contra dance world now, is that when people get married, then they quit coming, and then all of a sudden, 10 years later, they start showing up again, and you know
With
their
somebody
marriage is
else.
split up.
There's some, maybe this is an urban myth of people saying in the divorce settlement, they each get a certain dance.
Whether it's written down that way.
Yeah.
I know of couples who have made those agreements, you know,
Yeah,
that's
but
the
I mean,
last thing
yeah,
they-
yeah, I mean,
they've
the
settled
urban
on.
myth
You
of
get
that
the
actually-
Friday night dance, I get the Saturday night dance.
Yeah.
More than once, I've heard someone, usually a woman, say, I was in a square waiting for the music to start, and I looked around and I realized that I had been in relationships with all the guys in the square.
So someone, you just brought the dreaded contra word into the conversation. And I guess a question I have for us to ponder is, why was it that squares were so popular? And why is it that contras became so popular? And that in the last recent years, that has been such a growth phenomenon. What is it about that might be relevant for us, especially if we think about how we want to bring squares back into people's lives? And just, I mean, Phil has written glorious screeds on the subject of the effect of contra dancing. But what is it about the contras that have made them so popular and have pushed out the squares?
I have a couple of things that come to mind. One, just in passing, these things come and go in cycles. I heard, I have a quote from somebody saying that it was an old timer talking about the 1920s or 30s, where they were trying to promote singing squares and saying that all the people wanted to do were those old string dances, meaning contras. So that's almost 100 years ago now. It was hard to get people to do squares. They wanted to do contras. And then when I started out in the 60s, it was hard to get people to do contras. All they wanted to do was squares. And then 10, 20 years later, it started to reverse again.
Right.
So.
And it goes back longer than that. I mean, over.
Yeah, that it's not inevitable that contras will drive out squares. But I think one thing, and I'm not the first to notice this, is that the modern square dance movement started to take off in the 50s, which was a very conservative era socially. People respected authority for the most part. The contra dance revival started with the kids who lived through the social revolution of the 1960s, and there was a big anti-authoritarian sentiment. And I think that in a contra, the collar is less of a factor. You dance to the music, the collar prompts the first few cycles, and then it's become traditional for the collar to drop out because they're not really needed after the first few cycles. Whereas in a square, you by the nature of the choreography, you're dependent on the collar. And some people say they do contras because they don't like being told what to do constantly. So I don't think this is insurmountable, but I think it's a very real phenomenon.
I think that's really interesting, talking about that.
I think some of the contra thing is, when we talk about contras, I think we should get clear that we're not talking about traditional contras. If you tried to do chorus jig at a contra dance, at least around Asheville, they'd shoot you. They would not like the traditional contras. People do not want to be inactive. And so it's the modern contras that I see that are sort of driving the thing, where everybody's active all the time, and they're not going to go through a dance where you have to be inactive for any length of time. And that's part of what people objected to squares, because traditional visiting couple square, there's a minute or two where you're waiting your turn, and people just want to be doing it all the time. So I think for the same reason that people have rejected squares, they've rejected the traditional contras in favor of the newly composed ones. But there's so many things going on there that we see. There's certainly dancers who don't look at it as a social activity. They come dressed in gym shorts and a sweatband, and they're there as a, you know, for their week's exercise, and they just want to be moving the whole
Yeah,
time.
people used to dress up to go dancing, now they dress down,
Yeah.
at least the men.
With the men, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, it's
Women, it's not so
a
bad.
fiddler friend of mine always, we go to a dance and always say to me, look how beautiful the women look, and look at these guys, you know, like, just, don't they?
Well, they put skirts on.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they
what's with the guys wearing skirts?
Yeah.
Paisley skirts with striped t-shirts. It's like, hey, come on, guys, get a fashion sense.
David, one thing I loved about how you worded this prompt to this discussion is you said, what might be relevant here? And I think just, you know, listening to what Tony and Phil said, which are two very different picks, it's both very relevant, you know, and I think I don't think there are key themes, I think there's lots of things. And one of the things that I think about often, because I've observed this, it's a lot easier to call a contra dance than it is a square. And when I mean call it, I'm talking about it's easier to develop a repertoire of contra dances that will serve you over an evening or two. It's easier to know how to choose a contra dance in a program than it is a square. And it's easier often to teach and then literally call the square dance. And so what happens, I find, in a period of time, and I don't even know what decades I'm talking about, I'll let everyone fill it in, is that contra dance calling became a thing where people only call contras, where when I first started calling, and I was looking at my near peers, people who were a few years, you know, ahead of me in terms of the contra dance community, everyone called everything, you know, and when I think of the people who were calling, they were capable of calling everything, and they studied, and almost everyone who I was influenced by their elders, not by books or their peers. That when I think of, you know, the callers, they took calling seriously and rigorously. And then what I saw start happening is people started dancing, contra dancing for a couple of years, and then realized, oh, I could call one or two, and then they became a caller. And then they'd try a square, and they'd fail at that square because they only applied the same rigor of learning to call that square that they applied to contra dancing, and that gave them success as a contra dance caller because they could read their card, and then all of a sudden they tried to read the square, and they realized, oh, I can't do this. I gotta know this. And so I think that's one of the relevancies here, is that some people started calling squares, and it wasn't that people didn't like squares, they didn't like that particular caller calling that square because it took 15 minutes to teach it, and then when they called it, they tried to phrase a non-phrased answer, they tried to not phrase a phrased answer, whatever it was, and I think that's one of the relevancies.
So people got burned by poorly called,
Yeah.
poorly taught,
Either-
bad squares.
Or poorly chosen for that time of
Right,
evening,
right,
or for
right.
that night, or, I think that's part of the
I
relevancy.
think it's something else I've thought about is those of us who started calling in that era, we all came from the ranks of the musicians.
Absolutely.
And rather than and as
Well-
opposed to dancers stepping up and saying, "Oh, I like dancing. I'm going to be a caller," and I think there's something that happens
Well,
there too.
when I was
I don't think that's
calling,
universally true.
Oh, no,
Even
no.
with this group.
But Bob, were you a musician before you called?
Yeah.
Larry was. I was.
and I think that's really important. When I was,
A dance musician as opposed to a classical musician.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. I
yeah.
I
was
was a
playing.
classical musician,
was I.
but not a dance
Right. No,
musician.
I was playing for dances before I ever called.
And Ted Sinella was not a musician at all.
however, because Ted and I had many conversations about this, Ted was one of the most avid listeners, and that's what differentiated him from other callers who were non-musicians.
Well,
But I totally
and
agree with you.
he started in an era when squares were the thing, and
Yes.
when square dance calling was a fine art, and he learned from people who took it very seriously.
Yeah.
And as did he.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm convinced that a lot of the problem with squares now in the contra dance world is this vicious cycle that people don't like squares or think they don't because they don't get good squares, because the callers don't know how, because the callers haven't been exposed. You know, the callers don't have role models the way we used to. And that is something that we can turn around, starting with weekends like this.
Yes.
I'm really excited that so many of the people coming this weekend are callers, because hopefully they will take back to their communities, not just the specific figures, but the whole idea that calling squares is something that you got to work at, but that pays off big dividends.
I think you're right, Tony, and I'll just give an anecdote about Bob, you know, and and the role Bob played in my calling. You know, when I first, I was a musician, and a caller didn't show up, and I ended up having to call at a dance, and so I started,
Which is how Ralph Page got started.
yeah, and so I started calling.
Which is how I got
I started
started.
calling
That's
a
how I
little
got
bit,
started,
and
too.
Bob was
Kinda
running a
did, too.
dance weekend, and we had met, and Bob knew I was, you know, very influenced by what he was studying and just what he did artistically as a caller. And Bob hired me to be a part-time musician at Augusta, and I did that. And what I learned there, which to me was really important, is anyone I was really influenced in didn't learn from near peers. By near peers, I mean someone who's 2 years ahead of whatever you're learning how to do. That everyone I was influenced in sought elders, everyone, and went for primary source, they went deep into it. And what I found happening, and so that's what I did, and Bob inspired me to say, I want to do that too. And I sought out elder fiddlers and elder callers. And then what I saw happen in contra dance world, though, is that didn't happen as much as learning from near peers, so that a new caller was learning from someone who had only been calling for 2 years, and they only learned from someone who had been calling for 2 years behind them. And this concept of near peers is phenomenal. I actually did my graduate work in the study of children's games by learning from near peers rather than by older children. And there's both a parallel and a contradiction here, that when you only learn from near peers, you're not learning from a great bunch of depth. You're only learning from someone who's done it for, and I think that is what I saw in contra dancing. When I'd see someone and I'd find out who their influences were, it was someone who'd only been doing it for 1 or 2 years before them.
Interesting.
And that to me was really different, where you could go around this room and say, who did you study or influence, or what did you read, or what did you study? And everyone here will look generations. Well, they'll look at as much as we can find in terms of primary source, in terms of what we might call the real deal, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what's being lost right now, I think, because of this only learning from near peers.
Good point. Yeah, didn't something like that happen with modern square dancing in the 50s and 60s, where, you know, originally the callers learned from Lloyd Shaw, and then it got farther and farther removed. People would learn from somebody who would learn from somebody who would learn from somebody who would learn from Lloyd Shaw, and you had callers who had only been dancing a year or so would start calling, and they would start teaching other callers when they didn't know enough about it.
That, somewhat, but we had formal schools starting in the late 50s, early 60s. Gilmore was running a school, and
was it
Brundage was running a school.
Was it expected that if you were going to set yourself up as a caller, you went to something like that?
Not so much as a caller, but as a caller, if you were going to learn to call, you went to something like that, yes. Because it was available in New England, at least, Brundage and Johnston ran the school there starting in the 60s, and every caller I know in the Northeast attended one of those schools.
Okay, because
I went to Gilmore.
I've seen magazine articles from the 50s and 60s complaining that there were too many callers who were getting into it without really learning their trade.
There were a lot, many of whom came and went. But I went out to Gilmore School because I wanted to start teaching callers, and I did that in '59, so that I could learn how to teach callers, because we needed callers in our immediate vicinity in southern New Hampshire. We had clubs starting, and I'd run out of nights. I was then calling 7 nights a week, in addition to my full-time job. And we desperately needed callers, so I went to Gilmore to learn how to teach callers. And Brundage and Johnston ran schools that 2 or 3 a year in the Monadnock region with 30, 40 callers at each one. We were desperately teaching callers as fast as we knew how. But surely some then went on to, in part because they couldn't spare the time to go to school or whatever, but they taught others. Many of the survivors attended one of the formal schools.
And we're not necessarily teaching callers, but we're certainly gonna inspire a lot of callers
Yeah.
this weekend.
There is
So
not
let's
a lot
go.
of formal instruction these days in the traditional side.
Let's go eat.
So your plan was then, for this whole near peer thing, you just wanted to get the oldest bunch of people together that you could
Geezers.
find.
I've
I'm
gotten,
not qualified.
I've
I'm
got,
not ready to be an authority.
I've gotten some grief from people who said, you know, you've got no women in
No
the
women.
group. And my criteria were people who were really well-known, established callers, who really understood different traditions, and people who had done research and or published in writing or in video form, because the whole idea is to get it out. So someone like Lisa Greenleaf or Kathy Anderson, who know a lot about certain schools, they haven't done the getting it out in the same way. And I wanted people who had written about it or had produced videos, somehow who had thought about disseminating what they knew. And that's why you guys ended up here, and 6 seemed like a good number, and once I had the 6 of you, who needed anyone else?
It would be very helpful to have Lisa here.
Yeah, yeah, well, Lisa,
It would be very helpful if we could get Lisa to start disseminating what she knows.
yeah, well, she's,
She gets around.
She's moving there.
yeah,
She does it in person a lot.
yeah,
It would be good for her to think about that too.
Yes, it would.
yeah.
Yeah, the one weekend that we had her here, unfortunately, she had laryngitis and didn't call any squares.
Gee, was you hired as a caller?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was so frustrated.
I've got,
For her too.
Yeah.
one of the, I videotaped an interview with Clark Baker, who is on the Caller Lab board of directors and calls at the C4 level, modern, and also enjoys English country dance and contras, coming to that later, and sort of talking to him about what you love about modern and what you love about traditional and contras. And I'm gonna do the same kind of interview with Lisa, who started on the traditional side and now loves dancing at Tech Squares and dancing modern. To start, I mean, one of my not so subtle goals of this project is, I mean, I love it that we've got Western involved in this, that we've got Caller Lab supporting it, that we've got traditional and modern working together on a project. And for the two groups at least to understand a little bit better about what the attraction is. For traditional, I think there's not much room for modern dancers. There's not as much likelihood that modern dancers are gonna come over to traditional. I think there's an incredible opportunity for traditional dancers who are, contra dancers are always wanting more challenge, more challenge, more challenge.
We got challenged.
You got challenged.
And you get everybody active all the
Right.
time, which they want.
Exactly, and I think, you know, when people start up modern clubs without the costumes and without the couples requirements,
True.
they're gonna find a lot of people interested.
What about live music?
Well,
To me, that's one of my, that's sort of where I stopped.
That
Where
is
I've
good.
been to modern square
Yep.
dances and enjoyed it, but I need the live music.
That could be a stumbling block for a lot
Yeah.
of traditional
Yeah.
dancers.
yeah. In the same way
It's
that
a
some of
separate
us
group.
stumble at the notion of techno contras,
Right.
for the same
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
Let's go eat.